and more accessible than the notion of a number. If you ask somebody, what is the number 3, or what does the word 3 denote, you have a much more complicated task than using this more intuitive notion. And then you're using that intuitive notion as part of a definition of number, which doesn't involve any reference to numbers. So you're not using any arithmetical concepts at all, but you're using logical concepts and explaining what the arithmetical concepts are in logical terms.
Henry, do you want to add to this?
Sure, no, I mean, I just endorse all those comments. I mean, I was telling you the story about which object the number 3 ends up being on this story so that we can see where we end up at the end of the day. But Mike and Anthony are exactly right. It's a crucial part of the story for the purposes of Russell's project that there is another way of getting there that starts from just logical notions. So we don't have the notion of number sitting there undefined at the very foundations anymore.
Anthony Grayling, Russell attempted to reduce mathematical logic. You've been talking about that, you three. Then something came up called Russell's paradox, which caused him a lot of problems and lots of other people problems. A man to repudiate a lifetime's work. I think another great philosopher and so on. Can you tell us what Russell's paradox was, and then the three of you discuss it?
Basically, the idea is that Russell, using the notion of a class, which, as Hilary pointed out, is now referred to as a set, but using this notion, he came across the difficulty that some classes are members of themselves. For example, a class is, in being a class, is a member of the class of classes, and there are some classes which are not members of themselves. So, for example, if you had a class of, let us say, horses, a horse is not a class. So you get this distinction between kinds of classes or types of classes. And he came across the puzzle that what would you say of a class which was not a member of itself? If you had a class of all those classes that were not members of themselves, would that class be a member of itself or not?
What does a class not being member of itself actually mean? Could you give us an illustration?
Well, again, if we fast forward it, we'll give you a very clear illustration, which is that you might perhaps arbitrarily define classes as occupying different sort of levels, and you might say that a level 2 class is only allowed to have level 1 classes as members, and it can't be a member of itself. I mean, a very good example of a class that would be a member of itself is a class which is a member of the class of classes, and in virtue of being a class, it would be a member of the class of classes. The paradox that he came across is very similar to this. It's not exactly the same, so one mustn't be misled by the analogy, but it's a little bit like this because it makes it easier to understand. Supposing you have a barber in a mountain village who shaves just those men, all and only those men who don't shave themselves. So if a man in that village doesn't shave himself, he's shaved by the barber. Now our puzzle is, does the barber shave himself or not? Because if he doesn't, then he's part of the group who doesn't shave themselves and who's shaved by the barber. So if he doesn't shave himself, then he does. And if he does shave himself, then he doesn't. So this is the paradox. If he shaves all and only the men who shave themselves, then he both does and doesn't shave himself. And this is an analogy of the problem that Russell detected, which is, what happens if you have a class of classes which are not members of themselves? If it isn't a member of itself, then by definition it is. And if it is, then it isn't. And that's the paradox.
Mike Beanie, can you take that into the effect it had on others, particularly on the German philosopher Gottlob Frege?
Right, so Gottlob Frege was a logicist 20 years or so before Bertrand Russell, so we often think of him as the first logicist. He was a logicist about arithmetic rather than geometry, and he certainly thought before Russell that you could define the numbers in terms of, he called them extensions of concepts, which are essentially sets or classes. And for Bertrand Russell, for Gottlob Frege, Russell paradox was in fact a serious problem, because in his account, just like Russell realised, he did want to talk about classes being members of themselves. This is how you used to generate the natural number sequence defined as classes. So Bertrand Russell wrote to Frege in 1902, just as Frege was publishing the second volume of his great work, The Basic Laws of Arithmetic, when he was hoping to show that arithmetic could be reduced to logic. And Frege immediately realised that this was devastating. He wrote back and said, the foundations of my project are completely shattered. I don't know what to do. I mean, he tried in an appendix to the second volume of his work to respond to it, but in fact we now know that that doesn't work. And in fact, Frege ended up having to give up his logicist project, and he concentrated on developing his logical and philosophical ideas instead, and left it to Russell to try and resolve the paradox.
Russell blew up his own work as well as Frege's work, but what was it resolved, Hilary Graves?
Was it resolved? So Russell himself went on to, in 1903 he has Principles of Mathematics. This is his first attempt at logicism, but this is the version that falls to the Russell paradox for precisely the same reasons, more or less, that Frege's version of logicism falls to the Russell paradox. Russell's response was somewhat more robust than Frege's. He said, okay, we've obviously got a serious problem here. Our system is infected with paradox at the very foundations, so clearly we can't reduce arithmetic to logic in the particular way we've been trying to so far. But maybe we can start again and do it in a more careful way that will avoid this paradox. So this is what Russell spends most of the next 10 years of his life doing, rewriting the logicist project on more secure foundations.
And does he succeed?
Yes and no.
Silly of me not to realise that was Andrew, but what were the secure foundations that he thought he'd found?
So Russell developed something that he calls type theory, and here the idea is he takes a step back and looks at the Russell paradox and tries to arrive at a diagnosis of how we managed to end up with a paradox here. And Russell's thought is, okay, the reason we've got this paradox is that in the, let's call it naive set theory that we've been using so far, we have permitted a certain kind of self-reference. So we started talking about the class of all classes that aren't members of themselves. And Russell thinks, okay, the reason we've incurred a problem is that when we do that, in some sense by saying the class of all classes that aren't members of themselves, we're presupposing that all the classes are already there laid out. But then we're using that notion to define another class, the class of all classes that aren't members of themselves, and we want it to be the case that that new class we've just defined itself ends up being a member of the collection that was supposed to be there in the first place. So Russell thinks this is where we've gone wrong. What we need to do is write down a foundational theory that forbids that kind of self-reference. And if we can do that, we'll rebuild arithmetic based on these new foundations. And that's what he proceeds to do with his theory of types.